The camera drifts through a hushed forest at dusk, where the skeletal outlines of forgotten ruins emerge from a blanket of creeping ivy. The walls that remain stand like tombstones of a once proud age, their stone faces weathered by centuries, their silence holding back stories too dangerous or too sorrowful to speak aloud. No carriages roll up the gravel paths anymore, no noble laughter echoes from the great hall, no lamps flicker in the windows at night. What remains is emptiness, broken timbers, and the whispers of a family whose name has nearly vanished from history itself. Once, this was the seat of a noble house whose lineage stretched back into the shadows of medieval Europe. A family so powerful that their bannermen would ride at a single word, so wealthy that their halls were lined with imported marble, tapestries woven with gold thread, and relics said to be touched by saints. Their crest hung over churches, carved into stone above village gates, pressed into the wax of decrees and letters that changed the fates of those beneath them. To speak their name was to invoke authority itself, and yet, today that name is spoken only in whispers, if it is remembered at all. Legends tell us that the fall of this house was not slow, not the steady crumbling that comes with wars, debts, or mismanagement. It was sudden, almost surgical. One moment, the family lived and ruled and commanded respect. The next, they had evaporated, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a residue of dread. Their disappearance was not only a political or social vanishing, but something that felt unnatural. The story always circles back to a single moment, a single child, born into opulence, yet destined to mark the end of a bloodline centuries in the making. Some say the child's first cries were accompanied by strange omens, bells tolling without hands to ring them, animals scattering into the woods, storms rising where the skies had been clear. Others whisper that the birth was greeted not with joy but with hushed dread, for the family had been warned long ago that their line would not survive beyond one last heir. Who told them of this prophecy? Was it a traveling mystic, a priest, or an enemy who cursed them? We do not know. The origins of the warning are lost, but the effect lingers. The final child's birth became the fulcrum on which the entire house balanced, and then broke. As centuries passed, the truth dissolved into legend. Local villagers, too fearful to let the memory fade entirely, spun their own stories about what became of the family. Some insist that they made a pact with something infernal to secure their power, and when the price came due, it was extracted in full. Others claim the walls of the great manor themselves consumed the family, drawing them into a labyrinth of halls that now exist only in another realm. A few take a more human view that enemies erased their memory from records, destroyed their coat of arms, and let their once grand estate rot into nothing. Yet even the most skeptical admit that the disappearance left behind an unease that cannot be explained by politics alone. Walk the ruins today, and you will feel it, a pressure in the air, a sense that the stones themselves are watching. Travelers who camp near the estate speak of hearing footsteps pacing inside the roofless hall at night, or the soft wail of a child carried on the wind. Some even describe catching a glimpse of pale figures in the corner of their vision, only to turn and find nothing but moss and shadow. What is most disturbing is not the ruins themselves but the erasure. Families of noble blood usually leave behind records, portraits, surviving branches of kin who marry into other houses. But here, it is as though history conspired to close its hand over the truth. Their documents scattered, their estate pillaged, their descendants, if any remained, melted into anonymity. There is no easy answer, only fragments and rumors. This documentary sets out to sift through those fragments, the birth of the final child, the whispered accounts of servants, the folklore that clung to the family like cobwebs, and the eventual vanishing that left nothing but haunted ruins. Along the way, we will confront not only the historical clues but also the darker undercurrents, the possibility of a curse, the shadow of madness, and the enduring presence of something that never left the land even when the family did. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery is not how the noble house disappeared, but why so few dare to even remember them. Their story has become a ghost itself, drifting through history, visible only in fragments, echoing only when summoned. Tonight we call it back into the light, to ask the questions that others have avoided for centuries. What doomed this house? Why did their legacy vanish with a final child? and what secrets still linger in the ruins where their shadow has never fully passed. The rise of the family is shrouded in as much awe as its fall. To understand how a house of such magnitude could vanish so completely, one must first walk through its beginnings, back to the murky centuries, when power was forged not by laws or treaties, but by blood spilled on open fields and by whispered oaths taken under flickering torchlight. Their origins stretch into the medieval age, when Europe's borders shifted like restless specters and dynasties clawed their way into existence through conquest, marriage, and cunning. The earliest surviving mention of the family is found in a fragment of parchment preserved in the archives of a monastery that has long since turned to dust. It records a grant of land, rich hunting grounds, and a valley fertile enough to sustain entire villages, bestowed upon a warrior lord who had distinguished himself in battle. His name, inked in uneven Latin script, has been worn down by time, yet it is considered the seed from which the noble line would sprout. That seed was watered in blood, for their power was not inherited through peace, but seized through loyalty to kings and ruthless suppression of rivals. As centuries passed, the family grew in stature. They built a castle first, a fortress of stone, designed not for comfort but survival. Its towers overlooked the valleys, its gates guarded by men who would enforce their lord's will with cold efficiency. Around the castle, villages thrived under their patronage, though thrived is perhaps too generous a word. To the peasants who toiled on their lands, the family was both protector and predator. Taxes demanded obedience, protection demanded gratitude. Their rule was unquestioned, but it was also edged with fear. Later generations transformed the stark fortress into a manor of elegance, where banquet halls stretched beneath vaulted ceilings and frescoes painted by imported artists adorned the walls. They hosted feasts that spilled into dawn, where nobles and clergy alike came to dine at tables overflowing with delicacies from across the continent. They collected relics, not only sacred bones and saintly icons, but also objects steeped in mystery, talismans taken from foreign crusades, charms said to bring luck or curse those who gazed too long. Guests marveled at their wealth, but whispers followed. The family's fortune seemed too vast, too sudden, too unnatural. Yet their rise was not without consequence. Rivals envied their lands, enemies accused them of witchcraft, of heresy, of treachery against crown and cross alike. There are records of trials where distant cousins were dragged before inquisitors, forced to swear their loyalty not only to God, but to the family name itself, as though their blood carried suspicion in its veins. Somehow, the family survived these trials, through marriages that bound them to other powerful dynasties, through bribes that silenced inquisitors, through sheer intimidation. They weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser houses. Their ability to endure began to look less like luck and more like fate. Folklore from surrounding villages began to shape the family into something more than human. Farmers told tales of seeing the lords ride at night with hounds that had eyes like burning coals. Mothers warned their children that to cross the family's lands without permission was to invite misfortune, for the soil itself was said to reject intruders. In some stories, the family was blessed, chosen by divine forces to rule eternally. In others, they were damned, a bloodline bound by an ancient pact that traded longevity for something far more sinister. What makes these whispers harder to dismiss is how seamlessly they parallel the historical record. Each time the family seemed poised for ruin, they rose stronger. Their estates expanded, their alliances grew, their coffers swelled with silver and gold from trade, taxes and war spoils. And yet in the corners of these triumphs, small shadows gathered, sudden deaths of heirs, wives who vanished into cloisters without explanation, children buried before their names could even be recorded. It is as though every victory came with a sacrifice, every ascension marked by a price. By the Renaissance, the family had secured a place not only in the politics of their region but in its culture. They patronized poets and musicians, funded chapels, and commissioned works of art that still linger in museums today, stripped of their original context, but stamped with the unmistakable crest of their house. Their name was etched into stone, written into contracts, sung in ballads. To common folk, they were untouchable. To other nobles, they were rivals to be outmaneuvered or allies to be secured. To the clergy, they were both benefactors and subjects of suspicion, and still, the aura of something uncanny remained. In letters preserved from foreign ambassadors who visited their courts, subtle hints creep in. One writes of a banquet where laughter died suddenly, as though a chill had passed through the hall, and none dared speak of it. Another describes portraits of the family, painted with unnerving precision, where the eyes seemed to follow him wherever he walked. Another notes the absence of certain records, as though some parts of their genealogy were deliberately concealed. Every great house has enemies, and every great house collects its share of myths. But with this family, the myths cling too tightly, their roots running too deep. For centuries they flourished, and for centuries the whispers followed, weaving them into the fabric of both history and folklore. It is impossible to say where fact ends and story begins, because their identity was built upon both. Perhaps they encouraged the tales, cultivating fear to strengthen their rule, or perhaps the tales were born from truth, a truth darker than history dares to remember. What is certain is that they stood as a paradox, a house of splendor and shadow, of glory and unease. Their wealth and power were undeniable, their influence vast, and yet even at the height of their prestige, the first threads of their unraveling were already being spun. For those who looked closely, the signs were there. The family's story, so gilded on the surface, carried within it a rot that would one day spread through every branch of their lineage. That day had not yet come, but its shadow loomed long before the final child drew breath. Every noble house carries with it a genealogy of victories and defeats, but for this family, the lineage reads more like a catalogue of tragedies. Power never came to them cleanly, and each generation seemed to wear its wealth like a crown of thorns. To trace their history is to trace a bloodline marked not only by privilege but by death, betrayal, and a string of misfortunes so persistent that even the most rational observer cannot help but notice the pattern. It begins in the chronicles of the Middle Ages, when one of the family's earliest heirs, a knight of renown, met a gruesome end, not on the battlefield but in his own chambers. His body was discovered after a feast, lips blackened, eyes bulging, the unmistakable signs of poison. No culprit was ever found, though suspicion fell upon rivals, and even upon his own kin. The records note that his brothers fought viciously over succession in the weeks that followed, their disputes spilling into armed skirmishes that stained the family's estate with the blood of its own. In this family, inheritance was less a right than a gamble, and each generation seemed prepared to kill or die for it. The Renaissance brought no reprieve. The noble house grew more cultured, more refined, but refinement did not blunt the sharpened knives of ambition. Marriages, meant to secure alliances, often ended in scandal. One lady of the family, celebrated for her beauty, was found drowned in the manor's ornamental pond. The official explanation claimed it was an accident, but local gossip insisted she had been silenced for conspiring with a rival house. Another story tells of a son who returned from abroad with strange habits and stranger companions, only to vanish one stormy night, leaving behind only a trail of muddy footprints that stopped abruptly at the estate's edge. It was as though the family could never escape the pull of misfortune. Heirs died in childhood of fevers that no physician could name. Entire branches of the family tree withered away before they bore fruit. Some whispered of a wasting sickness that ran in their blood, a curse inherited in the body itself. Others believed their downfall was punishment, divine retribution for ancient sins committed by the family's founders, sins that no amount of wealth or piety could erase. Perhaps most telling are the jewels. The family's history is littered with them, brothers against brothers, cousins against cousins, challenges flung in anger across banquet tables. Accounts describe moonlit fields, where men in velvet cloaks drew swords against their own blood, steel clashing in defiance of kinship. The outcome was often fatal, and the survivors carried the scars not only of blades but of guilt that would gnaw through the years. These jewels were not isolated incidents, but a recurring theme, a self-inflicted thinning of their own line. The wider world began to notice. Neighbors saw the family as cursed, a dynasty too consumed by its own shadows to ever find peace. Priests warned that the devil's hand lay upon them. Superstitious villagers began to attribute even natural disasters, a bad harvest, a sudden fire to the wrath surrounding the noble house. And still, despite this grim reputation, the family persisted. They built, they schemed, they hosted lavish gatherings as though defiance itself could stave off whatever haunted them. Yet the tragedies grew bolder. One story tells of a wedding, a grand affair meant to unite two powerful houses. The banquet was extravagant, music and dancing filling the manor until the candles burned low. But by morning, the bridegroom was dead, a blade thrust into his chest. The bride's family accused his own kin. His kin blamed outsiders. The alliance crumbled before it had even begun, and the feud that followed would stain both houses for generations. Through all of this, patterns emerged. Almost every generation ended with an untimely death, a suspicious disappearance, or a sudden madness. One lord, said to be a brilliant strategist, descended into paranoia so deep that he ordered mirrors smashed throughout the manor, declaring that they allowed enemies to spy upon him from another world. He died soon after, alone in a windowless chamber he had bricked up himself. Another heir was struck by fever at the age of 12, and on his deathbed was said to have whispered that the family was being collected, one by one. These accounts, passed down in letters, journals, and oral tradition, blur the line between history and horror. What is undeniable, however, is the persistence of death within their walls. The family could rise to splendor, yes, but never without a shadow close behind. Their very legacy seemed written in blood, not only the blood shed in wars and rivalries, but their own spilt in patterns too precise to dismiss as coincidence. And so the myth of the curse gained strength. It was no longer merely rumor, whispered by peasants, but an explanation adopted even by scholars of the time. Chronicles note that the family lived under an unseen hand which struck without warning, as though time itself demanded their ruin. For some, it was a tale of caution, proof that no wealth or title could shield one from divine justice. For others, it was proof of something darker, that the family had bargained for power, and that every untimely death was a payment coming due. By the time the family approached its final generation, the blood-soaked patterns of its past were impossible to ignore. Every banquet carried with it a tension, every marriage a fear of tragedy, every birth a question: would this child grow to adulthood, or would the unseen curse claim them before their name could be written in the family annals? It is in this atmosphere of dread and inevitability that the last child was born, an heir whose very existence would herald the end. The story of the family cannot be told without pausing at the birth of the final child, the moment when history and legend become inseparable, when the line between natural misfortune and supernatural inevitability begins to blur. For centuries, the noble house had endured its losses, burying heirs, rebuilding fortunes, silencing scandal, and continuing forward as though nothing could sever its line. But with this birth, the end began to take shape. The year was marked in records that still survive, though the exact day is often omitted, as if even scribes hesitated to write it down. It was a season of strange weather. Chroniclers note storms that rose without warning, rains that turned roads into rivers, and winds that toppled trees like stalks of grain. On the night of the child's arrival, thunder cracked the skies above the manor, rattling the glass panes of the windows and shaking the foundations as though the earth itself bore witness. Servants would later whisper that lightning struck the grounds 3 times in succession, each bolt closer than the last, as though some unseen hand was pointing directly at the estate. Inside the birthing chamber, the atmosphere was no less fraught. Accounts gathered from letters and testimonies paint a scene of panic and awe. Midwives recalled that the candles would not stay lit, their flames sputtering out no matter how many times they were relit. The air was thick with smoke, though no fire burned. The mother, pale and trembling, seemed caught between terror and exhaustion, while the lord of the house stood grim and silent, gripping the arm of a chair until his knuckles went white. Those who attended claimed the labor lasted far longer than expected, as though the child resisted being born. When at last the infant arrived, its first cries were piercing, sharp enough that one maid swore the sound shattered a glass vessel on a nearby table. Omens accompanied the moment. A bell in the village church began to toll, though no hand pulled its rope. Horses in the stables kicked their doors, neighing wildly. Dogs howled into the storm. To some, These were simply the disturbances of a tempestuous night. To others, they were the signs of prophecy fulfilled. The last heir had come into the world under a curse. Descriptions of the infant vary, as though those who looked upon the child could not agree on what they had seen. Some say the baby had unusual eyes, one dark and one pale, giving it a disquieting gaze even in its earliest moments. Others insist its skin bore a strange mark, a birthmark shaped vaguely like a circle or serpent, that servants whispered about but dared not mention in front of the parents. Folklore would later inflate these details, painting the child as monstrous, born with teeth, or speaking in a voice not its own. What is certain is that the birth unsettled everyone present. Instead of joy, the atmosphere was heavy with foreboding, as though the family had brought into the world not an heir, but a harbinger. In the weeks that followed, the household struggled to settle into normal life. The lord and lady presented their child with the expected ceremony, blessings from priests, gifts from vassals, feasts to celebrate continuity. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. Servants spoke of restless nights in the nursery. The child cried in ways that did not sound like ordinary wailing, a drawn-out keening that made even the bravest attendants shiver. Nurses claimed the infant would stare fixedly into corners of the room, eyes following something unseen, and once, they swore, the baby laughed at nothing, a sound so strange that one nurse resigned her post immediately afterward, unable to bear the task any longer. Local villagers, already steeped in centuries of rumor about the family, added their own interpretations. Some believed the child was a blessing, the last chance for the house to redeem itself. Others whispered that the baby was the curse incarnate, the physical embodiment of all the sins of its forefathers. There were hushed conversations in taverns and marketplaces, predictions that the child would either save or destroy everything the family had built. Even among the clergy, unease crept in. The priest assigned to baptize the infant hesitated, according to marginal notes in a church ledger. He recorded that the ceremony was disrupted by a sudden draft that blew out every candle in the chapel. When relit, the flames burned blue for several minutes, a detail that so unsettled him, he considered postponing the baptism altogether. Ultimately, the rite was completed, but the priest's notes end with a chilling line. "I fear this child is set apart, and I pray the family knows what it has brought forth." As the months turned into years, the child's presence seemed to alter the manor itself. Servants reported cold drafts in rooms where fires roared, doors that would not stay shut, and mirrors that fogged without cause. Visitors described feeling watched in the halls, as though the portraits of ancestors were glaring down in disapproval of the new heir. Strange accidents occurred with increasing frequency, a chandelier crashing during a banquet, a carriage overturning on the estate's road, injuries that could not be fully explained. Each event was linked in hushed whispers to the child, as though misfortune now radiated from the bloodline's final vessel. Yet, outwardly, the family attempted to maintain appearances. They dressed the child in the finest garments, presented it at social gatherings, and insisted that their lineage remained strong. But those who looked closely saw the truth. The parents' eyes were hollow, the staff dwindled as more resigned than remained, and the once lively manor grew quieter with each passing season. It was as though the family, once bound by centuries of ambition, had begun to wither in the shadow of its final heir. The irony was cruel. For generations the family had clawed its way through tragedy after tragedy, always producing another heir, always pushing forward into the future. Yet with this birth, the moment meant to secure their legacy, their story began to collapse inward. The child was not simply another link in the chain, but the chain's breaking point. Some say the family knew it, even then, that they looked into the infant's face and saw not hope, but an ending. From that moment on, the noble house was no longer a dynasty in ascent, but a candle burning at its final inch of wax. And just as omens had marked the child's arrival, so too would omens haunt the years that followed, leading inexorably to the night when the house itself would vanish into silence, leaving behind only ruins and legend. If the nobles recorded their lives in ledgers and letters, the servants recorded theirs in whispers. They were the silent witnesses of the great house, those who carried trays through candle-lit banquets, who tended fires in drafty corridors, who hushed the cries of children in the dark. Their voices rarely made it into official records, yet centuries later, their murmured recollections would form the backbone of legend. To the outside world, the noble family seemed untouchable. To the servants who lived in their shadow, the cracks were already showing. The servants' tales begin after the birth of the final child. Nurses who tended to the infant were the first to speak of oddities. One woman swore she heard the baby cooing in the dead of night, not unusual for a child, except that she claimed it was answering something. From the nursery came not only the babble of an infant but pauses, and then faint, hushed tones in reply, as if a conversation were unfolding between the child and someone no one else could see. Another nurse reported entering the room to find the cradle rocking by itself, a slow, deliberate movement that ceased the moment she crossed the threshold. Other staff noticed changes in the manor itself. Doors left closed at night were found open in the morning, and locked chests discovered unlatched without signs of tampering. One cook described hearing footsteps pacing above her in the early hours, long strides across the floorboards of an empty hall. When she complained to the steward, he dismissed it, but she confided to others that she recognized the sound as belonging to the late master of the house, a man dead for over a decade. The longer the child grew, the stranger the tales became. Servants spoke of shadows where no candle should have cast them, elongated forms stretching along walls, as though something unseen moved just out of sight. One boy tasked with cleaning the upper rooms returned pale and trembling, refusing to ever go back. He claimed he saw the child standing alone in a corridor, though the nursery door had been locked and its nurse asleep within. More chillingly, he swore the child's eyes were glowing faintly in the dark. The family, desperate to maintain appearances, forbade gossip. Any servant caught spreading superstitions was dismissed without pay, sometimes without even the courtesy of a reference. Yet the stories could not be silenced. They traveled through kitchens and stables, slipped into the hands of villagers when dismissed servants returned to their homes, and took root as folklore. Each retelling grew darker. The child seen walking the halls at night, speaking in voices not its own, portraits turning their heads to watch over those who dusted them, laughter echoing from the empty chapel. One of the most persistent tales came from a maid who remained with the family until the very end. She claimed the final child had an invisible playmate, one that grew more demanding as the years went on. At first the child would point and laugh at corners of the room, as if in conversation. Later it began to speak aloud to someone, though the words were often strange, old-fashioned, or in languages the maid did not understand. On more than one occasion, the child screamed in the night, declaring that its unseen friend had threatened to take it away. Not all the stories were centered on the nursery. Servants complained of feeling watched as they moved through the halls, a sensation so strong that some swore they felt breath against the back of their necks when no one was there. Objects went missing, silver spoons, keys, even personal trinkets. Sometimes they reappeared in bizarre places, like the chapel altar or the family crypt. Other times, they were gone forever. A stable boy once found his lantern smashed outside the stables, though he insisted he had set it down carefully. He left the estate the next day and never returned. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from the kitchens. During a winter's evening, the cook prepared a meal when she heard a child's laughter echoing from behind her. Turning, she expected to see the heir, but the child was in the nursery, 2 floors above, guarded by a nurse. Instead, she saw a shadow pass across the doorway, the unmistakable outline of a child no taller than her waist. She later confided in the priest, who urged her to pray and to keep silent, for fear that speaking of such things might bring worse. Over time, the manor seemed to take on a life of its own, as though the stones absorbed the unease. The servants whispered that the house itself resented its occupants, shifting and groaning at night like a restless sleeper. A maid once insisted the stairway to the upper chambers added an extra step that vanished by morning. Another claimed the windows showed not the gardens but unfamiliar landscapes, vast forests or seas that should not have existed. These tales may have been exaggerations born of fear, but they reveal the atmosphere that had descended over the household, one of quiet terror, where even the most mundane tasks felt touched by something unseen. When the family finally disappeared, it was these servant tales that endured. Nobles wrote in ledgers of debts and alliances, but the staff carried away the more intimate horrors, spreading them into the villages and beyond. To this day, when travelers speak of the estate's ruins, they tell not of the lord's power or wealth, but of the whispers, the nursery that rocked itself, the halls that echoed with footsteps, the shadows that belonged to no living soul. In the end, it was the servants overlooked, dismissed, and often silenced, who became the keepers of the house's legacy. And their legacy was not of triumph or grandeur, but of unease, of whispers in the walls that warned of an ending no one could stop. If the servants whispered in corners, it was the villagers beyond the estate who shouted their stories into the night. Long before scholars came to ask questions, and long after official records grew silent, it was the people of the nearby hamlets who carried the tale forward. Around hearths and in candle-lit taverns, they built a mythology around the noble house's downfall, a mythology that became so entangled with memory that even today it is impossible to separate the truth from the superstition. The earliest village legends spoke of bargains. According to one thread of folklore, the family's ancestors had once pledged themselves to forces not entirely human. Some said it was the devil himself, others that it was a wandering sorcerer, a man who offered wealth and dominion in exchange for loyalty. The price, villagers claimed, was not immediate but generational. Each heir was a coin in the devil's purse, collected slowly until the debt was complete. When the final child was born, the account was settled. The house was not simply ruined by time or politics, it was erased, taken as payment for an oath sealed centuries before. Other stories told of a woman wronged. Some villagers swore that the family's founder had stolen land from a widow or spurned a woman rumored to be a witch. In vengeance, she cursed not him but all who came after. Her curse was said to be specific. The family would prosper until their arrogance convinced them they could defy fate, and when that moment came, their legacy would vanish with the birth of the last heir. Even centuries later, mothers would invoke the story to warn their children about pride and broken promises. Yet not all legends framed the family as villains. Some painted them as tragic victims. One ballad, still sung in fragments by old storytellers, describes the noble line as chosen by angels, marked by light but hunted by darkness. In this telling, the family's downfall was not a punishment but a battle they could never win. Each generation lost someone to the shadows, until the shadows claimed them all. To villagers who revered the family, these stories transformed their disappearance into a kind of martyrdom, a holy struggle between good and evil played out in blood and silence. Folklore clung especially to the final child. Stories about this figure are the most contradictory, suggesting the powerful hold the heir had on local imagination. Some said the child was born with eyes that glowed red in the dark, or with a voice that spoke in tongues. Others softened the tale, saying the heir was pure and innocent, a child who attracted the malice of spirits precisely because of that purity. In certain villages, mothers told their children to leave milk at the window, a ritual meant to appease the spirit of the child who never grew old. In others, villagers forbade even speaking of the heir's name, for fear that uttering it would invite the same doom. The ruins themselves became fertile ground for superstition. Peasants warned that to take a stone from the fallen estate would bring misfortune to one's household. Farmers avoided tilling too close to the manor's borders, claiming crops would wither or livestock would sicken. Shepherds whispered that sheep grazing near the estate refused to cross certain invisible lines in the grass, as though something unseen barred their path. Some said the land was poisoned, others that it was haunted, and still others that it was claimed, forever marked by the blood of its lost masters. Travelers passing through the region added to the lore, spreading the story beyond local boundaries. Merchants carried tales of spectral processions, pale figures seen walking from the ruins at dusk, a family in full ceremonial dress, their eyes hollow but their postures regal. Pilgrims whispered of ghostly bells ringing from the abandoned chapel, summoning no congregation but echoing across the valley, as though time itself had paused. These tales circulated widely, transforming the house from a forgotten estate into a legend whispered in markets and monasteries alike. Over time, folklore layered upon itself like sediment. Rational explanations, disease, financial ruin, political conspiracy, might have accounted for the disappearance. But the stories were too compelling, too poetic. They offered meaning where facts only offered silence. And so the legends endured. Even today, folklorists studying the region remark on how deeply embedded the tale of the vanished house remains. Old women still cross themselves when passing near the ruins. Children dare each other to shout the family's name in the dark, though few complete the challenge. The story has outlived documents, outlived memory, and become something closer to a superstition that clings to the land itself. It is striking, too, how malleable the legends are. In some tellings, the noble house is cast as cruel tyrants who deserved their fate, punished for greed and bloodshed. In others, they are noble martyrs, undone by forces beyond their control. The same event, their disappearance, is reimagined through countless lenses, reflecting the fears and hopes of those who retell it. What remains constant is the sense of inevitability, the idea that the family's end was written long before it arrived. For those who lived nearest the estate, the line between folklore and daily life blurred even further. Stories tell of villagers refusing to use wood from the forests once owned by the family, claiming it burned with a strange smell and left behind ash that would not scatter. Hunters reported hearing the cry of a child in the woods, luring them off the path, only for the sound to vanish when followed. At night, lights were seen flickering among the ruins, not lanterns, but cold blue glows that danced across broken walls like will-o'-the-wisps. Such tales might be dismissed as superstition, yet they reveal something vital. The family's disappearance was not experienced as a mere historical event, but as a rupture in the fabric of life itself. To the villagers, the vanishing of their lords was uncanny, unexplainable, and thus it demanded explanation through story. And in those stories, the noble house was not simply forgotten. It was transformed into legend, woven into the folklore of the land as indelibly as the seasons and the stars. Even now, when one stands at the ruins, it is difficult to ignore the weight of these tales. The ivy-draped stones seem to listen, the silence of the estate heavy with centuries of rumor. Visitors report feeling compelled to speak in hushed tones, as though the walls themselves might still hear. Perhaps it is only imagination, stirred by centuries of stories. Or perhaps the villagers were right all along. Some places are never empty, and some families never truly die. The story of the noble house could have ended with grandeur, with heirs marrying into great dynasties, with estates expanding across the countryside. But instead it took on a quieter, more sinister shape. The decline did not come with fire or rebellion, but with something slower, more insidious. In letters, parish records, and scattered testimonies, a pattern emerges: sickness, stillbirths, accidents, and a creeping misfortune that seemed to shadow the family's every step. It was as though the bloodline itself was unraveling. The earliest sign, according to documents that survive, was a string of fevers. These were not unusual in the era. Entire villages might be struck by outbreaks that carried away dozens. Yet in the manor, it was different. The illnesses clung to the family in particular. Servants would recover, visitors would recover, but the nobles themselves grew pale, weak, and listless. The matriarch of the house complained of sudden chills even in summer. Her letters described nights spent shivering beneath heavy blankets, unable to shake the feeling that someone stood at her bedside. The eldest son grew gaunt, his skin mottled with unexplained rashes. The family doctor prescribed remedies of the time: purges, tinctures, bleeding, yet nothing seemed to work. Then came the accidents. One child fell from a horse in what should have been a routine ride across the fields. Another suffered burns when a lamp overturned in the nursery, though no one could explain how it had tipped. A servant later confided that the lamp had not fallen, but had been lifted. She claimed she saw it rise, hanging in the air for a heartbeat before it dropped. Such claims were, of course, dismissed as hysteria, but the pattern was clear: misfortune was tightening its grip. Rumors spread quickly among villagers. To some it was proof of a curse, that the final child's birth had awakened forces long dormant. Others believed the family had angered the church. There are accounts of locals crossing themselves when the nobles rode past, muttering that God's hand weighs heavy on them. Still others whispered darker suspicions, witchcraft. Perhaps, they said, an enemy had placed a hex on the family. Or worse, perhaps the family themselves had consorted with sorcery, and now the price was being exacted. The tension between rational illness and supernatural punishment was reflected even within the household. The physician insisted that the fevers were the result of bad humors and poor air in the manor's damp chambers. The steward pointed to the family's declining wealth, claiming they could no longer afford the finest foods or medicines, leaving them vulnerable. But the staff, those who served by candlelight, who heard the scratching in the walls and saw shadows move where no one walked, they were less convinced. They spoke of a darkness that had settled over the estate, one no doctor could cure. The decline also left its mark on the family's once proud traditions. Seasonal hunts were cancelled after too many hounds fell ill. The annual harvest feast was abandoned when half the household lay bedridden. Weddings that should have been celebrated with pomp were hushed affairs, shadowed by funerals that followed too soon. Villagers who once looked to the manor as a symbol of power began to see it as a house of sorrow, a place where joy was fleeting and death always close at hand. Perhaps the most unsettling element of this decline was the way it seemed to focus on the children. The final heir, the child whose birth had sparked whispers of destiny, grew frail, prone to fevers that came and went without reason. Nurses described finding the child drenched in sweat, muttering strange words in half-sleep. At times the child seemed older than their years, speaking with a solemnity that unsettled even the clergy. "The walls are listening," the child once whispered to a tutor, refusing afterward to enter the library where portraits of ancestors lined the walls. Even those children who survived into adolescence seemed marked. Some accounts suggest that cousins who visited the estate returned home changed, restless, plagued by nightmares, speaking of figures at their windows. A priest summoned to bless the house recorded that the young suffer the most, as though something unseen delights in their torment. Whether these notes reflect genuine illness, or simply the spreading power of rumor, they deepened the conviction that the family's decline was not natural. By the time the manor reached its last decade, the slow rot was undeniable. Crops failed more often, livestock grew thin, and even the servants began to leave. Some claimed they could no longer bear the oppressive air, the sense of being watched. Others feared contagion. The noble family, once surrounded by loyal retainers, found themselves increasingly isolated, abandoned to their misfortunes. The villagers told darker stories still. Some insisted they saw ghostly lights moving through the manor at night, that the sick nobles were not alone in their suffering, but surrounded by spirits feeding on them. Others swore the family's decline was the result of their own sins, that they had dabbled in forbidden rites to secure their wealth, and now those rites demanded repayment. To these villagers, the sickness was not an accident, but justice. And yet, there remains a possibility that the decline was neither curse nor punishment, but simple tragic misfortune. The region was rife with outbreaks of tuberculosis and typhus. The manor's damp foundations could have bred mold or toxins that weakened lungs and immune systems. Inbreeding, common among noble families, may have compounded hereditary illnesses. From a historian's view, the explanation may be painfully mundane, but history is not written only in facts. It is written in the stories people choose to believe. And the people who lived nearest the noble house believed in something far darker. To them, the slow decline was no accident of biology or poverty. It was the work of forces unseen, forces that had been waiting for generations. By the time the family's presence dwindled to only a handful, the question was no longer whether they would endure, but how they would end. Some predicted fire, others a massacre, but the most chilling whispers said there would be no violence at all, only silence. That one day, the manor would stand empty, as though its inhabitants had simply stepped out of time. It was this tension, illness or hex, tragedy or punishment, that set the stage for the event still spoken of in hushed tones, the vanishing itself. There are moments in history when the silence is louder than any battle, when the absence of sound is more terrifying than screams. For the noble house, that silence descended one night without warning, leaving behind nothing but questions. Records do not describe a massacre. No fires were reported in the parish register, no looting noted by neighbors. The estate, once alive with voices, simply fell quiet. By dawn, the great house stood empty, its halls abandoned, as though time itself had skipped a beat and carried its occupants away. The exact date of the disappearance is contested. Some sources place it in the late autumn, when nights were long and the first frosts clung to the fields. Others suggest it was spring, a season of renewal, making the vanishing all the more unsettling. What all accounts agree upon is this: the night was ordinary, until it wasn't. Servants prepared meals, lamps were lit in the manor windows, and villagers saw smoke curling from the kitchen chimney. Then, sometime in the deep hours, the manor's light went out, never to return. The first to notice were the villagers who lived closest. A shepherd leading his flock at dawn reported the manor gates standing wide open. This was unusual, even unthinkable. The noble family kept strict order. Gates were locked at sunset, and watchmen patrolled the grounds. The shepherd, unnerved, avoided going closer, but told others in the village of what he had seen. Later that morning, when no riders came from the estate, concern grew. A group of peasants ventured to the manor and found it eerily still. What they discovered became the foundation of centuries of speculation. Rooms were untouched, as though abandoned mid-life. Trays of food sat half-eaten. A candle burned down to the wick, dripping wax onto a table, but there was no sign of who had lit it. Beds were unmade, clothes were laid out as though for the coming day, but their owners were nowhere to be found. Not a servant, not a child, not a single member of the household remained. Even the animals seemed caught in the mystery. Horses were still in their stables, saddles unused. Dogs lingered in the courtyard, howling mournfully, refusing to enter the house itself. Livestock lowed with hunger, as though they had been left untended through the night. In every way the estate looked lived in, and yet its inhabitants had vanished. The villagers searched, calling through halls, descending into cellars, climbing to the upper chambers. They found no blood, no signs of struggle. Windows were unbroken, doors unforced. There was no indication of flight or kidnapping. Some swore they heard faint echoes as they moved through the manor, like whispers carried on the stone, but when they listened closely, there was only silence. Word spread quickly. Clergy were summoned, fearing plague. Officials rode in from neighboring towns, certain they would find evidence of a massacre or rebellion. Yet each inspection revealed the same unsettling truth. Nothing, no bodies, no tracks, no explanation. It was as though an entire household had stepped out of the world. The most chilling detail recorded in local chronicles comes from the chapel. On the altar lay the family's Bible, open to a passage warning of judgment and exile. Some claimed it had been deliberately placed there, others that it fell open on its own. The page, according to a surviving description, read, "And they shall be scattered among the nations, and I will draw out a sword after them." To the villagers, this was no coincidence, but a sign that the family's fate was sealed by divine or infernal forces. In the absence of evidence, stories flourished. Some swore that strange lights were seen above the manor that night, blue flames drifting over the rooftops, vanishing into the woods. Others spoke of an unnatural storm, thunder without rain, circling only above the estate. A few claimed to have heard music, faint and otherworldly, carrying through the valley, a procession of sound accompanying the family's departure. These testimonies could never be proven, but they lingered, fueling the legend. Historians searching for rational explanations have proposed many. Could the family have fled in secret, escaping debts or enemies, staging their disappearance? Yet if so, why leave behind their wealth, their heirlooms, their animals? Others suggest a massacre covered up by local officials, perhaps to protect the reputation of the region. But again, no graves, no blood, no evidence of violence. Still others argue plague struck the manor, and the bodies were disposed of to prevent contagion. Yet if that were true, why did the villagers who entered the house remain unharmed? The lack of answers has made the vanishing fertile ground for darker interpretations. Folklorists see in it the culmination of the curse, the final debt collected. Paranormal enthusiasts argue that the family was not killed but taken, drawn into another realm by the very forces they had bargained with or defied. Some versions even suggest the house itself consumed them, that its walls and foundations swallowed the living, leaving only empty chambers behind. What makes the mystery endure is not only the disappearance, but the completeness of it. Entire households had been lost before to war, to fire, to rebellion, but those events left scars evidence. Here there was none. The absence was too clean, too perfect, as though engineered not by chance but by design. For the villagers who stood in the manor's halls in the days after, the memory never faded. They described the silence as unbearable, a silence that pressed against the ears like weight. Some refused to stay after dark, claiming that the house seemed to breathe, its walls creaking with sounds that were not the wind. Others swore that footprints appeared in the dust of the great hall, small prints, like those of a child, leading nowhere. In time, officials sealed the estate. The noble house, once a place of wealth and power, was abandoned, left to rot. Ivy crept over stone, roofs collapsed, and the once proud chapel became a ruin. But the vanishing remained fixed in memory. Every generation retold it, adding their own details, their own fears. Some said the family still walked the halls at night, invisible to the living. Others believed they were bound to the land, appearing as lights in the fields when the moon was high. The truth, if truth exists, was lost in that night. All that remains is the silence, a silence that swallowed not only a family but an entire chapter of history. And it is in that silence that the story lingers, unsettling, unanswered. To this day, when one stands among the ruins, the air feels heavier, as though the walls still remember. No birds nest in the upper chambers, no animals graze too close. At dusk, shadows stretch across the stones in shapes that seem too deliberate. Travelers say the silence deepens there, swallowing footsteps, muffling voices. Perhaps it is only the power of suggestion, or perhaps it is something more, a lingering echo of that night, when the noble house vanished, not with a scream, but with nothing at all. In the days after the vanishing, the manor became less a home than a wound upon the land. The first villagers who dared enter brought back tales of silence, of untouched meals and abandoned rooms. Soon after, the church arrived, wary of plague. Priests walked the halls with incense burners, their voices trembling as they recited prayers for souls they could not see. They left as quickly as they came, recording only that a strange stillness lay upon the house. Officials followed. A magistrate from the nearest city inspected the estate, searching for evidence of flight or foul play. His report, though now lost, is said to have been inconclusive. There were no broken doors, no bodies, no tracks leading away. The gates had been left open, yet the family's carriages stood untouched in their sheds. The magistrate departed with more questions than answers, and the case was quietly set aside. Perhaps the authorities feared scandal. Perhaps they simply knew that no explanation would satisfy. For the villagers, the absence was unbearable. They had lived for generations under the shadow of the noble house. The manor provided work, protection, and a sense of order. Now it stood empty, its windows dark, its corridors echoing with nothing but their own footsteps. At first they tried to continue as before, tending fields, gathering in taverns, but something in their world had shifted. The estate's silence seeped into the valley, a reminder that what had always seemed immovable could vanish overnight. Practical concerns came first. With the noble line gone, who owned the land? Who would collect rents, enforce laws, or offer patronage? For a time, chaos reigned. Farmers held back their tithes, uncertain to whom they were owed. Local bandits grew bolder, sensing the absence of authority. Small disputes that would once have been settled at the manor escalated into feuds. The disappearance of the family was not only a mystery, it was a destabilization, a collapse of the order that bound village life. But alongside these practical concerns, something deeper stirred: fear. Many villagers refused to go near the estate, convinced it was cursed. Stories spread of those who lingered too long at the manor falling ill, of strange marks appearing on their skin. Children dared one another to creep up the drive, but none stayed after sunset. The house became a place of dread, a void where a family had once been. The church responded with ritual. Priests declared masses for the missing souls, urging the faithful to pray for their deliverance. Some bishops suggested the family had been taken by God, like the righteous men of Scripture who vanished without death. Others were less charitable, calling it a judgment, a sign of sin concealed within the house. But whether divine blessing or divine punishment, the clergy offered no explanation that calmed the people's unease. What is striking is how quickly folklore overtook fact. Within weeks, new stories emerged. Travelers swore they saw the family walking the fields at dusk, silent and pale. Shepherds spoke of music drifting from the empty chapel, hymns sung by voices no longer living. A miller claimed he found footprints in the frost, leading to the manor gates. Small footprints, as if left by a child, but none leading away. These accounts were impossible to prove, yet they carried weight in taverns and markets. Truth mattered less than the sense that something uncanny had occurred, something no magistrate or priest could explain away. Generations passed, and the aftermath deepened. The estate was left to rot, its walls collapsing into ruin. Ivy crept over broken stone, owls nested in rafters where tapestries once hung, and yet the absence never faded. Travelers wrote of the unease that clung to the ruins, of locals who still crossed themselves when passing nearby. The land, once fertile, was said to produce only withered crops. Some farmers swore their plows struck stone foundations in fields that should have been clear, as if the house was spreading invisibly beneath the soil. In time, the disappearance shaped identity itself. The villagers came to define themselves not only by their work or their church, but by their proximity to the vanished house. They lived in the shadow of a mystery, inheritors of a silence too great to ignore. Parents used the story to frighten children into obedience. Behave or you will vanish like the noble family. Lovers met in secret at the ruins, swearing that their promises would outlast the curse. Even skeptics, who mocked the tales, could not dismiss the weight of the silence. Scholars, centuries later, would argue that the true aftermath was psychological. The vanishing had robbed the people of certainty. If a noble house could disappear without trace, what else might crumble? Kingdoms, empires, families. The event became a parable of fragility, a reminder that no power, however grand, was immune to erasure. And yet, for all the theories and interpretations, the physical reality remained the same. A house left empty, its inhabitants gone. No bones were ever found. No letters surfaced explaining a flight. No grave markers bore their names. The aftermath was not resolution, but an enduring void. Even now, when visitors step into the ruins, the absence is palpable. The air is colder in the manor's foundations. Shadows linger longer than they should. Some swear they hear faint sounds, a child's laughter, the clink of a goblet, the murmur of voices just beyond reach. Whether these are tricks of imagination or echoes of the past, they remind us that the true aftermath of the vanishing was not only historical but spiritual. The noble house had vanished, but its silence remained, a silence that outlived empires, carried forward not in ledgers or decrees, but in whispers, a silence that still asks a question no one can answer. How does a family disappear, not with death, but with nothing at all? When a mystery refuses to yield its truth, all that remains are theories. In the centuries since the noble house vanished, countless explanations have been offered. Some are rooted in history, others in superstition. Each tries to fill the same void, to explain how an entire family could vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but silence. And yet, with every theory comes new questions, cracks in the reasoning that refuse to close. The first and most obvious explanation is flight. Some historians argue the family simply fled. Perhaps debts had become insurmountable, or enemies at court threatened their lives. By vanishing into the night, they could escape obligations and begin anew elsewhere under assumed names. It is a tempting solution, rational, human, almost comforting. Yet the evidence collapses under scrutiny. Why, if they fled, did they take nothing with them? Why leave behind their wealth, their horses, their clothes, their heirlooms? Families escaping ruin cling to what little they can carry. This family left everything. The idea of flight answers one question, but raises a dozen more. Another theory points to massacre and cover-up. Could the family have been murdered, their bodies hidden to conceal the crime? Bandits, rival nobles, or even rebellious servants might have orchestrated such a plot. In this telling, the empty estate is not supernatural but political, yet here too the evidence resists. No blood was ever found, no doors forced, no graves unearthed. To erase not only the living but every sign of violence would have required precision bordering on impossible. And why conceal it so completely? A rival who destroyed a noble line would normally boast of it, not bury the deed in silence. A darker variation of this theory suggests plague. In times of pestilence, entire households could vanish within days. Perhaps the family succumbed, their bodies burned in secret to prevent contagion. The church may have sanctioned such an erasure, leaving only silence in the records. This explanation is compelling, for outbreaks were common and terrifying. But again, inconsistencies remain. Why did the villagers who entered the estate suffer no illness? Why were meals left uneaten, beds still warm, as though life had stopped mid-breath? Plague kills, but it does not erase. From here, the theories grow stranger. Some speak of collective madness, a psychological unraveling brought on by years of illness, misfortune and fear. Perhaps the family, convinced they were cursed, abandoned reason and walked willingly into the wilderness. A priest's note even hints at this, suggesting the nobles gave themselves to despair. Yet this too falters. No tracks led away. No witness saw a procession of figures leaving. Madness explains their state of mind, but not the completeness of their disappearance. It is in these cracks, where reason fails, that the supernatural theories take hold. The most enduring of these is the ancestral curse. Generations of villagers believed the family had been marked from the beginning, bound by a pact or punished for a crime long buried. The birth of the final child was the trigger, the last thread in a tapestry woven centuries before. When the child cried its first breath, the bargain was fulfilled, and the family was taken, not by illness, nor by human hands, but by fate itself. This theory offers no comfort, but it explains the eerie timing, why the decline accelerated, why the vanishing seemed inevitable. Another folkloric thread speaks of witchcraft. Some versions claim the family themselves practiced forbidden rites, summoning powers that turned on them. Others argue they were victims, hexed by an enemy whose curse worked patiently across generations. In this interpretation, the vanishing was less an act of violence than an act of collection, the family spirited away by forces they could not resist. Such tales are steeped in the era's fears, when unexplained misfortune was often laid at the feet of the supernatural. And yet, they endure precisely because they match the uncanny details, the child's strange mutterings, the rocking cradle, the sense of unseen presences in the house. The most unsettling theory is the one whispered by both servants and villagers alike. The house itself devoured them, not literally in brick and stone, but as though the manor was alive, a vessel of some darker will. Servants had spoken of the walls listening, of staircases shifting, of rooms appearing different from one day to the next. What if these were not hallucinations but glimpses of the truth, that the house was not a home but a trap, waiting for the moment to close? In this telling, the vanishing was not a disappearance but an absorption, the family drawn into the architecture, into the silence that still lingers among the ruins. Modern paranormal investigators add yet another layer, a crossing between worlds. They speculate that the family did not die but slipped into another realm, whether by ritual, accident or design. Perhaps the final child was a vessel, a doorway, and when the night came, the threshold opened. This would explain the completeness of the vanishing. Why no bodies, no signs, no trails? They did not leave. they shifted into a place just beyond reach. Such theories may sound fantastical, yet they capture the imagination precisely because they explain what reason cannot. And then there is the most chilling possibility of all: nothing at all happened, that the records are wrong, the tales distorted, the story exaggerated until absence became vanishing, misfortune became curse. Perhaps the family simply dwindled, deaths scattered across years, heirs lost in obscurity, names erased by time. In this telling, the vanishing is not a single night, but a slow fade, mythologized by villagers who needed drama to explain decay. This theory is cold, rational, plausible, but it feels hollow. It strips away the atmosphere of dread, and perhaps that is why it is the least satisfying. Each theory reflects not only attempts to explain, but the fears of those who retell them. The flight theory speaks to fear of poverty and dishonor, the massacre theory to fear of betrayal and violence, the plague theory to fear of unseen contagion. The curse, witchcraft and devouring house reflect fears of the supernatural, of powers beyond human control. Even the idea of nothing at all speaks to the fear that our greatest mysteries are illusions, that meaning itself can vanish. And yet, after centuries, no theory holds firm. The noble house remains gone, its absence intact, its silence unbroken. Perhaps that is the point. Theories are attempts to tame the abyss, to draw borders around the inexplicable. But this story resists taming. It defies explanation, like a wound that never closes. For those who stand in the ruins, the question is not which theory is true. The question is why the silence feels so heavy, why the stones seem to hum with memory, why travelers leave convinced they were not alone. Theories offer scaffolding, but the abyss remains. And in that abyss, the noble house lingers not as fact, not as fiction, but as something in between, a haunting that no theory can resolve. Though the noble house was gone, its name refused to die. It lingered like smoke after a fire, clinging to the valley, poisoning the memories of those who lived in its shadow. The family had vanished, but their blood, their curse, remained in whispers, in warnings, and in the dread of being connected to them. At first, the legacy was carried by rumor. Villagers spoke of distant relatives, cousins, and cadet branches of the line who had survived outside the manor walls. Some said these distant kin avoided the valley altogether, terrified that the curse would follow them if they dared return. Others claimed the bloodline scattered across the countryside, concealing themselves under new names, forever hunted by their own ancestry. There were even tales of people discovered centuries later who bore the family crest on a ring or signet, only to die soon after being recognized. Whether true or not, these stories suggested that the bloodline could not be outrun. Fear attached itself to marriages. Local families hesitated to wed their children into even the faintest trace of the vanished line. A rumor that a suitor carried their blood was enough to doom a match, no matter how wealthy or respectable. For generations, mothers told daughters, "Do not marry into that name. Their blood is not safe." It was as if the disappearance had infected the lineage itself, turning ancestry into a contagion. What is chilling is how bad fortune was retroactively tied to them. When crops failed, villagers muttered that someone had consorted with a descendant of the vanished house. When a child was born sickly, it was whispered that their mother's blood carried the curse. Even when no clear link could be traced, the fear persisted. It became less about genealogy and more about stigma. To be associated with the family in any way was to carry an invisible mark, a shadow that no prayer could cleanse. The church struggled with this inheritance of fear. Some priests preached that the family's vanishing had been divine punishment, and thus anyone tied to them bore a dangerous taint. Others tried to dispel the superstition, insisting that bloodlines cannot inherit damnation, but the people rarely listened. Fear is stronger than doctrine, and so, despite sermons and sacraments, the idea of a cursed bloodline endured. By the 18th century, traveling folklorists recorded chilling variations of the tale. In one version, the last child of the family had survived in secret, hidden by servants, but their descendants carried deformities, signs of unnatural heritage. In another, the family had been taken not by death, but into service of a darker master, and their progeny walked among ordinary people, unaware of their true inheritance until tragedy struck. These stories blurred the line between folklore and paranoia, but they kept the curse alive, expanding its reach across centuries. The fear of the bloodline even extended to neighboring noble houses. Records show at least one rival family refusing to inherit lands left vacant by the vanished estate. Their reasoning was never written outright, but letters suggest they feared entanglement in the old shadow. Other houses that did acquire parcels of the land often found themselves plagued by scandal, infertility, or unexplained misfortune, events that villagers were quick to attribute to the lingering curse. Whether coincidence or self-fulfilling prophecy, the effect was the same. The family's absence became an active force, shaping decisions and destinies long after their disappearance. By the 19th century, when rationalism began to challenge superstition, scholars attempted to reframe the family's story. Historians suggested their vanishing had simply been exaggerated, their decline no different from countless other noble lines erased by time. But even as dusty ledgers reduced the event to an anomaly of inheritance, the people clung to the curse. To them, the bloodline was not an academic problem, but a living memory, one that shaped marriages, land deals, and even patterns of migration. It is worth asking, why did the curse survive when the family did not? The answer lies in the power of absence. A death can be explained, grieved, recorded. A disappearance cannot. The family's vanishing left a vacuum that demanded explanation, and into that vacuum flowed fear. The curse became a narrative that filled the silence, giving shape to dread that had no outlet. And once established, it was passed from generation to generation, retold in stories, whispered in warnings, embedded in lullabies and folk tales. In some regions, children's rhymes carried echoes of the family. One recorded in the late 1800s went, "Beware the cradle that rocks at night. Beware the child with eyes too bright, for blood that vanishes leaves a stain, and what is lost will come again." This rhyme, sung by children with no memory of the vanished house, shows how deeply the fear had seeped into culture. The bloodline no longer needed to exist physically. It existed in the imagination, a legacy of fear rather than flesh. Even today, genealogists and amateur historians occasionally stumble upon families rumored to be distantly tied to the vanished nobles. Some embrace the association, using it as a mark of mystery or prestige. Others recoil, refusing to discuss the connection, as though silence itself might ward off the curse. The stigma has lasted so long that in some circles people half-jokingly claim bad luck runs thicker in those with even a drop of that blood. And so, the family's disappearance achieved something rare. It erased their bodies but immortalized their name. Their bloodline became not a line of inheritance but a haunting, a legacy of fear that outlived them, shaping marriages, rumors and folklore for centuries. In this sense, the curse was real, not as a supernatural force, but as a social one, a shadow that never lifted. The vanished house did not die with its final child. It lived on in the dread that followed, in the whispered warnings, in the stigma of blood. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all, not to vanish completely, but to remain forever present in fear. Time has a way of softening history into legend, of turning grief into story. By the time 2 centuries had passed since the vanishing of the noble house, the tale no longer belonged solely to archives or priests' notes. It belonged to the people, to storytellers by the hearth, to singers in taverns, to children daring one another to recite verses in the dark. The family's fate, once tragedy, became myth. The earliest surviving ballads speak not of politics or famine, but of a cradle that rocked on its own. The song describes a child who never slept, whose eyes reflected candle flames as though alive with something otherworldly. The verses do not end with an explanation. They trail off, unresolved, mirroring the silence of the historical record. Listeners would leave with unease rather than closure, as if the music itself carried the same unanswered question: where did they go? In the villages near the ruins, the tale took root as a warning story. Parents frightened disobedient children with it: behave, or you will vanish like the noble family. The manor became a symbol of divine retribution, proof that pride and corruption would be punished. In some versions, the family was said to have mocked the poor, only for God to strike them down. In others, they had turned to forbidden rites, and their disappearance was the price of arrogance. Folklore rarely preserves complexity. It chooses morality, and in this case, the moral was simple. Those who stray from humility will vanish. But not all the tales were moralistic. Some were hauntingly romantic. In ballads from the late 1700s, the last heir was reimagined not as an infant, but as a young maiden who fell in love with a figure from the other world, sometimes a ghost, sometimes the devil himself. When the family refused her union, she is said to have summoned her lover, who spirited the entire household away in one night. These ballads transformed tragedy into Gothic romance, turning the vanishing into a tale of forbidden love too powerful for the mortal world. Travelers carried the story far beyond the valley. By the 19th century, folklorists recorded versions as far away as coastal fishing towns, where sailors swore that the noble family had not died, but walked the seas as phantoms, cursed to wander until the end of days. In the highlands, the tale morphed again. The family had been taken into the hills by the fair folk, punished for building their manor on sacred ground. Each region reshaped the silence into something that fit its own fears. The most unsettling strand of folklore, however, remained tied to the ruins themselves. Local legends warned that anyone who entered the estate after dark would hear footsteps behind them, though no one followed. Travelers described seeing candlelight in windows that no longer stood. Children dared each other to touch the stones, claiming the coldness would cling to them for days. Over time, the ruins became less a place and more a stage, a canvas onto which fears were projected, stories performed, and mysteries relived. Some storytellers insisted that the family never truly vanished, but were still present in echoes. Farmers swore they heard laughter on the wind, or the faint sound of a baby crying across the fields. Shepherds claimed to glimpse figures at the edges of their vision, dressed in tattered finery, fading when approached. These stories kept the family alive, not as memory, but as presence, unseen but felt, woven into the land itself. By the 20th century, the tale had taken on a distinctly ghost story form. Newspapers from the 1920s mention hikers who reported strange lights and voices calling from underground. Amateur ghost hunters sought the site, convinced that the vanishing had left a scar on reality. Some claimed the family had been pulled into another realm, and that the ruins marked a thin place, a threshold where the living might hear the lost. Whether these accounts were fabrications or genuine experiences, they reinforced the idea that the family had not vanished. They lingered. Folklore also carried subtle echoes of identity. For the villagers, telling the story was a way of setting themselves apart. We live in the valley of the vanished house. It gave their home a uniqueness, a shadowed history that outsiders found both fascinating and terrifying. To this day, guides and locals alike retell the story, not as dusty history, but as something living, part of the air and soil. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the folklore is how it thrived on silence. Unlike tales of battles or saints, there was no resolution, no climax with moral certainty. Instead, storytellers leaned into the absence. They ended with unfinished lines, with sighs, with gestures toward the ruins. The story worked because it lacked an ending. Each retelling invited listeners to fill the silence themselves, to imagine what they feared most. In this way, the noble house became more than a vanished family. It became a mirror. For some, it reflected fear of divine wrath. For others, of forbidden love. For still others, of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The silence of history gave rise to a chorus of interpretations, none conclusive, all unsettling. And so the story survived. Not in ledgers, not in archives, but in songs sung in taverns, in rhymes whispered by children, in ghost stories told by firelight. The noble house was gone, but its silence had been transmuted into culture, immortalized not by fact, but by fear. Even today, when modern travelers pass the ruins, they find graffiti carved into the stones, initials, dates, snippets of verse. The newest layers of folklore are written, not in ink or song, but in scratches left by those who came to test themselves against the silence. Some leave in awe, others in fear, but none leave untouched. The vanished house remains, not in brick and mortar, but in story. Ruins have a way of drawing the living. Even centuries after the noble family vanished, their crumbling estate still stands, a skeleton of stone wrapped in ivy and silence. What remains is not enough to reveal what happened, yet too much to forget. For historians, folklorists, and thrill-seekers alike, the site has become a magnet, a place where absence is almost tangible. And in the modern era, the ruins have acquired a new role, not just a stage for ghost stories, but a testing ground where reason and the supernatural collide. The first serious attempt to investigate the estate came in the late 19th century, when antiquarians and amateur historians descended on the valley. Armed with notebooks and shovels, they sought to uncover material traces of the vanished family. They found fragments, collapsed staircases, shards of pottery, rusted hinges, the remnants of hearths where fires once warmed noble halls. Yet what struck them most was not what they found, but what they did not. No family tomb, no record of burials, no sign of the final child's existence beyond whispers. Their reports, published in obscure journals, often read more like Gothic fiction than sober archaeology. One noted, "The silence of the estate is heavier than its stones. One feels observed, though no eyes are present." By the 20th century, with the rise of folklore studies, researchers turned their attention not to the ruins themselves, but to the people. They interviewed locals, recording rhymes, tales, and superstitions passed down through generations. The villagers spoke not with academic detachment, but with reverence, even fear. Many refused to enter the estate, claiming the air there was unclean. Some agreed to guide researchers to the site, but would not step beyond the threshold. To the villagers, the vanished family was not history. It was presence. The ruins also became a stage for the paranormal revival of the 1960s and 70s, when ghost hunting groups, equipped with tape recorders and crude instruments, sought to capture evidence of hauntings. They reported strange phenomena, voices faintly audible on playback, fluctuations in temperature, shadows moving against the laws of light. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of technology, misinterpretations born of expectation. Yet the recordings circulated, adding a modern layer to the legend. For a generation fascinated by the paranormal, the vanished house was proof that history could still bleed into the present. In recent decades, more advanced investigations have continued. Thermal cameras, electromagnetic sensors, motion detectors, all deployed within the estate's decaying walls. Results remain inconclusive. Some claim to have captured figures moving in empty corridors, visible only through thermal imaging. Others report sudden spikes in EMF readings near the remains of the family chapel. One researcher described a night where the air pressure shifted so abruptly that their ears rang, though no storm approached. The most unsettling accounts, however, are not technological. They are human. History is often written in victories and ruins, in the stones of castles and the ink of treaties. But sometimes, history is written in silence. The noble house that once dominated its valley left behind no heirs, no graves, no closure, only absence. It is this absence, more than anything else, that has endured. For centuries, the family has existed not in flesh and blood, but in whispers, in shadows, in the imaginations of those who cannot bear the void. When a family vanishes, we expect discovery, bones unearthed, records uncovered, letters decoded, but here there is nothing. And it is this nothing that terrifies. We can face tragedy, however cruel, so long as it is comprehensible. But what do we do when a family ceases to exist, as if erased from time? What do we do when history offers us no body to bury, no truth to record, no ending at all? This is why the vanished noble house lingers in the imagination, not because of what we know, but because of what we do not. Their disappearance is less a story about people than it is a story about fragility. It asks us to consider how quickly permanence crumbles. A manor, once a fortress of stone and status, is now ivy-strangled ruins. A family, once bound by lineage and legacy, is now a name whispered like a curse. What feels immovable today may be dust tomorrow. Yet the story is not only about fragility, it is about the weight of memory and how memory transforms. What was once scandal became folklore. What was once tragedy became legend. What was once silence became song. Each generation has reshaped the family's fate into a mirror of its own fears, plague, curses, conspiracies, hauntings, and in doing so, they have ensured that the family never truly vanished. Absence became presence. Silence became voice. We often think of haunting as ghosts rattling chains, as apparitions flickering in candlelight. But perhaps the truest haunting is this, when absence itself becomes a presence. The vanished house is haunted not by specters of the dead, but by the void they left behind. A void that cannot be filled, no matter how many theories, no matter how many excavations. The silence is its own ghost, pressing down on those who enter the ruins, demanding to be felt. And so the question lingers, what remains when houses die? Stones crumble, names fade from ledgers, songs distort over time. Yet something persists, not tangible, not provable, but undeniable. A presence in the absence, a shadow in the silence. The noble family may have vanished, but the fear they inspired, the questions they left, and the stories they seeded remain alive.